Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Joel and I have been talking about an interesting phenomenon that we see come up that is related to type and society, but not just to society, but also to society's timelines. So let me unpack that a little bit. When you look at Myers-Briggs types, we're talking about 16 archetypes. And archetypes are patterns that we've observed of people showing up over and over and over again throughout history. Well, we talk a lot about how we are microcosms or individual manifestations of macrocosms, macrocosms being like social manifestations. And if society can be mirrored in individuals and individuals can mirror society, then that means you can personality profile or type an entire society. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in that society is going to be of a single Myers-Briggs personality type, but there's going to be certain characteristics that are more and less favored by those societies that will mirror an individual's relationship with their cognitive function preferences. So let me give you an example of what we mean. So we are in the United States, and for a while now, the United States has had a preference for quite a long time of judging tendencies. So we can really see this actually, especially in the mid part of last century and before. There was a lot of emphasis placed on judger quality. So judgers, by definition, use the four cognitive functions of introverted sensing, introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, and extroverted feeling as their dominant and auxiliary or cognitive functions, or what we call the driver and co-pilot in the car model. So that means that for a long time, the United States had favored or had a strong preference for those cognitive functions. You can see that in time periods where we really poured a lot of time and effort into infrastructure, where we were quite forward thinking in how we believed we would, develop as a nation or a society. You can really see that in emphasis on conformity at certain time periods in history, conforming to sort of like a collective ideal, don't stand out too much, etc. And what we've seen recently is a shift to more of a perceiving style. And so when whole societies take on characteristics of certain, dichotomies, like the four-letter dichotomy or certain cognitive functions that go along with those dichotomies, that doesn't necessarily mean that is a stuck position. The type or preferences of whole societies can shift over time. Now, that's a little different than our philosophy and how it shows up for individuals. We don't believe that individuals change their personalities or personality types, rather. Like our cognitive function stack is pretty set, and we might explore different aspects of that type, but we pretty much stay the same type. But whole societies will not necessarily do that. Whole societies might actually shift in their preferences, their cognitive function preferences. So we want to talk a little bit, actually really kind of focus mostly on this concept of developed countries heading a different direction in their personality archetype and some of the implications of that and whether or not we're doing it well.
Yeah, look at an example of this. Go all the way back to the early 1900s here in the United States. Henry Ford starts the Ford Motor Company and the Model T, and he says, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. That's what his statement was to his employees and the people building some of the first automobiles. Because at the time, they just needed to get cars on the assembly line and get them out the door. And fast forward, in the last 10, 15 years, an American fast food chain, Burger King, has the slogan, have it your way. You can have any food item on their menu contextualized and customized to exactly what you want, your individual expression through your food. You can see how we went from a one-size-fits-all, you can have any color you want as long as it's black, all the way up to you can have your sandwich with any possible combination on it that you want. And you can see how mass customization, mass marketing around like making sure you get the exact thing you want. You can order a computer tailored to you. You can order clothes tailored to you. Anything you want can be tailored directly to you. And I see this as a shift. Technology has enabled this to some degree, but it's also a mimetic shift. And I think another example you can see here, this is from my standpoint, this is my viewpoint here, is how people drive. I've noticed that when I was growing up as a kid, many years ago and beyond, before I was even a kid, watching people drive down the freeway, a lot of people were driving, how I would say it is, in herds. In other words, you move, like here in the United States, we drive on the right side of the road. So you're on a double lane highway or a 4-lane highway. People would often move into the right lane, and it was very much accommodating everybody that's on the road. And I noticed today, a lot of drivers are much more individual focused. They don't even realize they're sitting in the left lane, in the passing lane for, sometimes minutes on end, blocking traffic to where people have to pass them on the right. And I've seen that shift literally in my lifetime. I've seen people start to drive in a more perceiver fashion, more focused on what their own individual experience is, and less tied into the herd driving together on the freeway. That's just something simple that I've noticed, at least in the part of the country that I live in. And I think it patterns out across the United States. And I don't know if other Western countries have this as well, but I've noticed this change just in my lifetime.
Yeah, I was thinking, you and I are both pretty big Mystery Science Theater 3000 fans. And the newest incarnation is RiffTrax. It's basically a show that has the silhouette, well, RiffTrax not so much, but it's basically a show that runs a not very well done movie or short.
A B movie, usually.
A B movie, right? Or a short from from history from the past. And then three dudes, start making fun of it over the soundtrack. And it produces a lot of hilarity for me, and it produces a lot of hilarity for you. So we're pretty big. We'll just call it MST3K from now on, because that's its nickname, and Mystery Science Theater 3000 is a mouthful. Anyway, so we're pretty big MST3K fans, and we've watched a lot of shorts or short films from the 50s that were instructional films for elementary, middle school, and high school students. And the number one message through all of these shorts feels like conform.
Do not be an individual at any cost.
That's right. Be neat, tidy, make sure your nails are clean, wash your hair once a week, have study buddies, don't get too horny if you're a teenager, right? Back off the pedal on that. Make sure that you don't stand out in any way in your dress, and just conform. And these, for the time period, that was how society viewed everything as being super, that was how things ran well. Very post-war, very a time period of abundance, new abundance from a place of massive scarcity. And that abundance was going to continue on as long as we all did our part. If you look at it through the lens of spiral dynamics or the Graves model, which we talk about a lot on the podcast, very spiral dynamics blue or Graves level 4. Well, we entered a time period in the 80s of a lot of people graduating to spiral dynamics orange, or what's called Graves 5. And when that happened, things started to get a lot more individualistic to a point now where, like you mentioned, Joel, if you tried to show that film even if you modernized it, even if everything was updated and the message was the same, there's no way I think that a group of high school students would even come close to being okay with listening to a message like that. Everything is about individualism. Everything is about representing, our particular ideals. And I have a theory as to why we're moving towards a perceiver time period. Now, in the past, when we moved towards perceiver time periods, it seemed like we moved towards an introverted feeling style of it, which is very individualistic, not necessarily anarchistic, but it's questioning, it's questioning the status quo. It's a lot of questioning to make sure that my experience is being represented. I think people who do a lot of introverted feeling, there's a lot of introverted feeling movie screenwriters, and you can almost kind of tell this when you see a lot of dystopian movies and novels come out, because that's, they're really questioning whether or not that conformity is something that's even ethical.
Yeah, I would say that the 1960s, late 1960s into the 1970s, at least here in the United States, we saw a lot of this pop up around music, movies, the hippie movement, alternative lifestyles. It was trying to be a rejection of that 1950s Leave It to Beaver or Norman Rockwell paintings type lifestyle, and paint a picture of what's authentic for us. A lot of communes, living on the land. A lot of these themes emerged during that time period.
Yeah, and I think it's because there were legitimately problems and challenges going unsolved during the I'll use your vernacular, the Leave It to Beaver time period. And I think introverted feeling wasn't willing to sacrifice the individual experience for the quote unquote greater good in order to make sure everything was copacetic. So yeah, I agree. I think that time period was very introverted feeling. But the perceiver time period we're entering right now is, I'm racking my brain and I'm trying to think of another time period that mirrors it. Even though we've seen moments of it spike up, I think for the first time, really, that I can chart, but I'm not a historian, so if you, the listener, has a time period in mind that you think also mirrors this, what I'm about to talk about, please let me know in the comment section, because I'd really like to get a compare and contrast of another time period that's similar. But it feels like as a perceiver culture, like we're entering, or maybe even staying in a perceiver culture, but it's going really into introverted thinking, which I can't think of a time period that was so insistent on introverted thinking. Most of the time, introverted thinking gets rejected. And the reason why is because it feels mean. A lot of times people feel like introverted thinking feels mean. And what we've done...
Cold is a better word, probably.
Yeah, cold. And what we've done is we've compartmentalized introverted thinking into disciplines like science. Like, it's okay for scientists to be cold rationalists. That's okay. And mathematics and that sort of thing, like the Cold War time period, or World War II, working on nuclear bombs and that kind of thing. The Manhattan Project. That's all the place where introverted thinking goes. But as a culture, we don't use that as a predominant judging process. But right now, it feels like we are, or at least we want to be. The challenge is that introverted thinking, when done poorly, is a very sharp sword. No, excuse me. When it's done well, it's a sharp sword. When it's done poorly, it is a dull blade. Introverted thinking, when done poorly, is a dull blade, and it hurts. It hurts like the dickens when people are using it poorly. And as an ENTP that uses introverted thinking as my auxiliary process, and as somebody who has done a lot of work around it, I'm noticing we're using it in a pretty crappy way. We are not using it well as a society, but we want to be. So I thought we could maybe talk a little bit about, if we're going to enter a time period that focuses on introverted thinking, how can we make sure that we're doing it well? How can we make sure that we don't hurt each other in the process? It's an interesting concept to think in terms of not just being on the receiving end of these fads and trends in society, but actually be able to identify what we're experiencing and then try to craft it in as good a way as possible. So when we get through this introverted thinking time period and we've crafted it well, then whatever else we move on to, we'll be crafting that well too, even though not everybody is using it.
I think we might date ourselves a little bit here as far as the time of this recording, but the principles are going to stay true. But I think I need to mention a few things that are exemplary, or examples. Maybe that's the right word I'd use. Exemplary, right? Yeah. Not necessarily what you want to look toward to exemplify or to do, but examples of the world in what's emerging right now. If you look around as a bellwether or as a canary in the coal mine, you see popular media springing up that will reinforce this idea. So people like John Oliver on, Last Week Tonight on HBO, who I believe is probably using TI or accuracy or introverted thinking like you're talking about. And I think that people like him, or Jon Stewart, who used to do The Daily Show, or who's somebody else I'm thinking of?
Adam Ruins Everything.
Adam Ruins Everything. Thank you. The show Adam Ruins Everything. These are all examples of this introverted thinking popping up. And even if you look at our political climate, I mean, we just had an election. Again, I'm dating this episode, but just you'll look back and see this. We just elected a president here in the United States that uses introverted thinking, uses accuracy as one of their cognitive functions from my type guess on this person.
Yeah.
And so, and again, you can argue with me if you don't agree with that type assessment, but just understand the principle underneath this. We believe that it is a time period where people are craving it in all of its forms. Some are done better than others. And I was just reading an article yesterday about Stephen Colbert, who I don't believe is an accuracy user or introverted thinking user. I think he actually uses authenticity, introverted feeling. He's one of the late night talk show hosts, right up there with John Oliver and Jon Stewart, these kind of guys that are up there talking about current events, and he's struggling. He doesn't have the traction that some of these other people that are using introverted thinking have, because he's coming at it with a different function that may not be the right time of our existence for.
More of a performance frame.
Yeah.
He does it through performance, and introverted thinking does it by just calling it.
Penetrating the data points, like getting right down to the marrow of what's happening.
Yeah, there can be a little performance in there, but it's definitely more focused on just articulating. And by the way, when we talk about our type guesses on some of these celebrities, we're open to being wrong, but this is our best assessment, including but not limited to the the president-elect at this point. We believe that he's using introverted thinking, but as a co-pilot process, and I personally don't think he's using it very well, but he's definitely using his extroverted feeling 10-year-old or tertiary process in a very marketable way.
Well, he might be using that introverted thinking to the degree where people are resonating with it enough. He's illustrating the markers of it that are saying to people, wow, I like that. I like that introverted thinking part. I like that accuracy that person's bringing. Even though maybe it could be more mature in how it's brought out, it still simulates it enough for people. And I think our world is craving it like crazy right now.
It's a quality of wanting somebody to tell it like it is.
Exactly. And that's what they're looking at.
Yeah, it's a quality of wanting to rest into somebody saying, this is my truth and I don't care if you agree or not. And I think etymologically, my suspicion is that, I don't know what all the nodes in the system are, but one of the nodes in the system seems to be that, I've talked about this principle before, but one of my heroes, Robert Anton Wilson, mentions in one of his interviews that during a more modern time period, we used to have one authority figure for information, like a set of encyclopedias. So if you had a question around when something happened or some of the data points around it, you would just go check your set of encyclopedias, and whatever the information in there was, you would rest into and rely on that. He said that his wife had a habit of purchasing many sets of encyclopedias. It was just like every time she saw a set someplace that was affordable, she'd pick it up. So they had eventually like 10 different sets of encyclopedias back in like the 60s. And when he was writing his books, he would go check a piece of information in not just one set of encyclopedias, but in multiples. And he said that just even dates, like things that were supposed to be quote unquote empirically true, that there could be up to 3 or 4 different dates for that event, depending upon the set of encyclopedias he picked up. Like he said, it was crazy. But nobody really knew that, because why would you have more than one set of encyclopedias at that time? Well, fast forward to a postmodern world, and he mentions that what the internet has done for people, or he mentioned before he died, that what the internet did for people in a postmodern world is it gave them the ability to see what he saw 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It gave them the ability to see that instantaneously, meaning that if you looked up a piece of information, it could be corrected. It could be, if it's on Wikipedia, it could be corrected multiple times depending upon the person editing it. Or it could be just contradicting a piece of information on another website. You could have many different data points that seem like they should be empirical. You could have multiple different data points for the same question. And what that does is it means that people lose faith in experts. It means that they stop handing over the power of data and information to other people. And that means that we, as the reader, as the receiver of the information, of multiple different types of information, we've got to be the final arbiter of what truth is. We've got to kind of feel it or default to whatever makes sense for us. And that means that we all have to hone introverted thinking as much as possible if we're going to be the person who finally determines the data points. 2
things come to mind as you say that. Just this week, Facebook released that they are going to begin censoring out fake news items on their platform because they believe that it was leading to people behaving in ways that may not be best for all of us based on quote unquote fake news. And so instead of allowing people to determine what is true for themselves and try to learn how to process information, they're falling back, as far as I'm concerned, onto an old way of doing this and censoring things on purpose for people, which I think is a bad idea, because then people aren't learning how to vet what's true and what's not. They're still going to now rely on somebody like Facebook to make that decision for them. And another thing that's happened in recent times too, here in the United States, we've had Common Core come into our classrooms. And the whole goal of Common Core, a way of teaching students, instead of looking at the results so much, it's trying to teach the thinking behind how they get the results. I know there's been a huge backlash against this, but from my standpoint, teaching kids, teaching students how to think, how to get to the answer, and how to slice and dice the information in all the different ways and think about the processes of thinking, I believe is a very TI or introverted thinking way of going about it. I think it's a good thing for us to learn in our modern world where we cannot rely upon news sources or hierarchies or institutions to vet our information for us. It's just too much information for them to do that. It's too much information for any one person to do. So we have, as people, we've got to get better at figuring out how to think better. And I think that there are things moving in that direction, like Common Core. And I'm disappointed that Facebook is making the decision they're making, because I think it's removing the ability for people to learn how to do that on their own. But I do see these things coming down the pike. And I keep thinking of example after example of this introverted thinking, this very perceiver way of doing thought processes. I see it coming all over the place from all different angles.
In both your examples of Facebook and Common Core, there is a painful learning process to get there. Facebook short-circuited it, and I have to go back and forth on this, or I don't have to, but I end up going back and forth on this because as somebody who uses introverted thinking, I'm going to be radically honest.
Please do.
Most people are terrible with logic. I mean, just people are just terrible with logic. And not because people don't have the ability to be analytical and really understand logic.
And it's not that they have bad intent necessarily.
No, I mean, and of course, as introverted feeling, that is something that's way more on your radar than mine is intent. I don't even care about intent, really. But most people are just abysmal at it because there's nothing in our culture in the United States that trains or teaches formal logic unless you actively go pursue it. Like, you've got to choose it as an elective. There's nothing that says you have to learn formal logic. And so we're just bad at it in general. But here we have a time period where it's demanded of us because the consumer technology requires it from us. Like, the consumer technology outpaced us socially. Our social technology of being able to understand formal logic is massively lacking in comparison to what the consumer technology that we've invented and we have access to now is demanding of us. So people are just really terrible at it. And in Facebook's, I kind of understand Facebook's choice because in order to get to a place where people have trained themselves to be better at spotting fake news and not just assuming every piece of information that comes at them that confirms a bias has to be right. There's this painful learning process to get to the other side. And I could see somebody making the choice to go, I don't think we as humanity have time for everybody to catch up in this. So I understand making those kinds of choices. But by the same token, like you said, we've got to learn this process. We have to learn how to do this. And then in the case of Common Core, I know that you recently visited your son's elementary school.
Yeah.
And his teacher was saying that Common Core is a painful process the first year, but by the second year, once the kids have integrated it, like, what did he say, that they outperform previous years, or?
He was just talking about all the extra work. You know, parents have a backlash against all the extra work, like in a math problem, for example, slicing and dicing the math problems all apart. But what it does is it trains the student's mind to be wired to slice and dice information, the thought process. And every year they start to take some of those ways and it gets faster and faster and faster. So it is difficult, especially when you're transitioning from how you used to do things to the new style. But once you get going on that road, every year it starts to build upon itself, is what he was indicating to me. Now, I'm not a teacher. I'm not in the education field. I'm taking one anecdotal elementary, fifth grade teacher's word for it. However, what he was telling me resonated with me as far as what I can see how things work, like how I learn things and how things seem to speed up for me as I develop the thought process behind them. So it seemed fairly reasonable that he's right on this.
Yeah, well, and if that one anecdotal, piece of information, because, again, this is the time period that we're doing it right now. What we're doing is we're picking up pieces of information and we're trying to we're trying to fit them into a larger narrative and make sure that we're not just confirming our own biases. We're trying to use introverted thinking right now, even on the podcast as we speak. So one person's opinion does not a complete concept make. And yet at the same time, it does seem that Common Core's backlash is based on an entire generation of adults that have not learned these strategies of introverted thinking as much, not sure how to facilitate the same information for their kids. And so it feels wrong or bad or off.
Well, and then also the people in power don't want the federal government telling them at the state level what to do. There's a lot of levels to why there's backlash against this.
Of course, it's super political, as everything is, seemingly. But the point is that in the two instances you use with Facebook and with Common Core, there's growing pains. And there would be patience required. And I think a legitimate question that, maybe sort of kind of quasi keeps me up at night is, can we go fast enough? Are we able to, as people, develop this process collectively fast enough to meet the challenges that are demanded of us? Like, we want radical honesty, and we want to implement it, but we're not so good at it. I mean, an example of this is YouTube comments. YouTube comments on our Facebook, or not Facebook, but our YouTube channel. So many years ago, Joel and I were like, hey, so let's just sit down, record 16 different videos. It was mostly like trying to figure out a proof of concept of whether or not we could even get a YouTube channel started. And, we just kind of talk casually about 16 types, not very deep dive. It was like not a deep dive at all. It was just kind of like a shallow. I mean, if you're a podcast listener, we turned them into a podcast as well and made them available on that channel too. But mostly it was just to see if there was a proof of concept. Now, years later, we've got 100,000 views on INTJ's, YouTube channel or whatever. And you go through and you look at the comments on the YouTube, underneath the videos. And I mean, for the most part, it's really cool because the INFP one, there's almost a community that sprung up in the INFP video. It was really interesting to see that. And then in other ones, all of the comments are really negative and bad, and people are just telling us we don't know what we're talking about. And then in other ones, you
changed my life. In other ones,
yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting to see how it showed up. And the same thing with we recorded what's called the mind wiring videos, which were intended to be just short little podcasts really that got smushed together and turned into a webinar. And again, it was just a proof of concept thing. We just threw it up. And the kind of comments that I'm seeing on both of them, or both meaning the mind wiring videos and also the type secret videos, is what feels like an attempt to TI. It feels like an attempt to do introverted thinking. People are like, oh, you're scamming us. You're just trying to scam us. And don't listen to them because they're using hypnosis.
That was the other day. That was crazy.
It was kind of funny. I was like, dude, if I knew how to use hypnosis, I don't think that I would be doing this. But it was they're just trying to scam, so don't listen to them. And another one was like, well, you're just trying to you're marketing too much. You're saying your name too much. Personalityhacker.com, you say it, multiple times, and that's just advertising, and you're just trying to it's all this fear around being tricked. This fear around
misinformation.
Yeah, the fear around misinformation or being manipulated or being tricked into doing or thinking something that they're not supposed to. And so the triggers of introverted thinking are coming up. The red flags are coming up. But what to do with that and how to play it out, it doesn't seem to be there. And so you have all the worry or anxiety of it, but without any of the strategy to be able to deal with it.
I think that's the thing is, at this point in history, because of the internet and because you have availability of information to you, you can go online and any position you want to take, any narrative that you want to cast forth in the world, you can find quote unquote facts and figures or perspectives or information to back those things up. And I think this is where it comes down to is people they realize this at a gut level. They realize that, wait a minute, everybody's got proof of why they believe what they believe. If everybody has proof, then nobody has proof. What is actually proof of information anymore? What is accurate anymore? What is real anymore? Because seemingly, we just went through a presidential election recently. It seemed like both sides had legitimate points and facts to back it up. Now, some people look at that and go, well, fact checking, this isn't true, this isn't true, this isn't true. But it seemed like the facts didn't matter. It was like they would just pull things and put them forth in whatever context they needed to make sure that, quote unquote, they're proving their point. And I think this is happening all the time now in our life. And I think underneath it all, we realize that's what's happening. And we're like, we've got to do something about this. We've got to get really good about introverted thinking. We've got to be good about the thought process. And the instinct is right. And we're shifting that way as a society. But we don't really have the skill built to also do that, because that's a talent. That is a skill. That's something you build over time. You, Antonia, as an accuracy, introverted thinking user, you weren't just born with this ability. You over time had a natural wiring for it, and you've gotten better and better and better of rooting out your own biases. So now you can see others in other pieces of information. It's not a process that happens overnight, and that's a talent of yours. Can you imagine if this isn't a talent of yours?
Yeah, it's a talent, but not a skill. I mean, a natural skill you just get. Like, you have to build the skill over time. And it took me years. I mean, like as using introverted thinking as my auxiliary process, it took years for me to get to a point where I felt proficient using it. And I'll give you one marker or indicator of whether or not you're using introverted thinking well. If you have even a hair's breadth of emotion fueling your assessment or evaluation, you are not using introverted thinking. And this was something it took me a long time to figure out. I'm using introverted thinking the best when I am in a completely emotionally neutral place. Like, I have the ability to hold space. And by the way, I know I use the phrase hold space a lot. Somebody said that if you do a personality hacker podcast drinking game, you take a shot every time we say hold space. So I recognize that I'm using that phrase again. But that said, you can, when you're using introverted thinking, you can hold space for basically the world's emotional output. You just hold it at bay. Like, the world's emotional output, you hold at bay, and that includes your own, because confirmation bias or logical fallacies, actually any form of bias, lives in the emotional expression of want. You want to believe something. So if you're getting emotionally triggered at all and you can't hold that at bay, you are not using introverted thinking in that moment. You're using something else. And that requires a level of rigor that even people who have it as a dominant process, it takes them a long time to truly build skill in that. When you get upset about something, now something can be a turnoff, as in like, that's a piece of data that my brain is rejecting because I don't feel like that one fits. So if you've got something that's saying, that piece of information isn't fitting, it doesn't fit in this puzzle, I can't see where the data goes, using this framework. Like, if you can't fit it in and you reject it, that doesn't mean like emotionally throw it aside, or that piece of data like bugs you or frustrates you or makes you mad. If the data piece is angering you for some reason, you are not using introverted thinking at that moment. All right. If you get emotionally triggered by it, no data piece should be emotionally triggering. If you get emotionally triggered, you cannot look at that data piece with clarity. Clarity requires an emotionally neutral stance. Now, this is a tough thing to do, and you can see that society as a whole is really crappy at this. Everything seems to be triggering. I go back to those YouTube videos, and when somebody makes a comment about like it really frustrates me that you blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, you're not using introverted thinking if you're frustrated. When somebody gives a piece of feedback, like even criticism, when they're like, I like the information, but I didn't really like how you presented it in this way because I felt that, maybe using personalityhacker.com multiple times in the mind wiring videos, I felt that interrupted the flow of data, or it threw me out of the experience. So my preference is that you would not use that. That feels like introverted thinking to me. So in order for society to get better at this, everybody's got to stop being so triggered. Everybody's got to stop being so emotional.
Well, I mean, can we expect society to get better at this, though? I mean, what you're saying is we're asking people, there's only 4 types that use introverted thinking, and we're asking the other 12 types to now use something that's not in their wheelhouse. Can we expect that of people? And I guess that's the question, is like, we are moving in this time period where it's more needed because we have so much information coming at us. But my question is, you're an ESFJ listening right now, and your strength is not introverted thinking. In fact, that's your 3-year-old or your inferior process. Your strength is with harmony, with extroverted feeling. Your strength is connecting with people, keeping the social truth going. Regardless of maybe the actual truth that's happening, the social truth is really where you function best. And, you're in a climate maybe or a situation where the social truth is we all believe this thing or we all think this thing because it helps us connect with each other socially. And now information comes that conflicts with that. You're going to be very tempted to reject that information. You're not going to want to adopt that because it ruins the social truth you have of the tribe you're running in or whatever else. So I guess, to me, we are moving this direction. How do the rest of us that don't use introverted thinking, how do we deal with a world that's going to be requiring this of us more and more? And I think that's a real challenge. I don't know if we have the exact answer yet, but I think this is the questions we need to be asking ourselves. And that's, I think, why I feel so discouraged when Facebook decides to shut off all fake news, is because you've just removed the ability for people to use that as a way to vet news sources and actual information. I think that's really powerful for people to share a story with all their friends and then get that social feedback like, this isn't accurate. That censorship of somebody who shares a story that's not accurate, and then they get their friends saying, this isn't accurate. Why are you sending misinformation out to the world? They then get to reevaluate, oh, maybe I should look at that information first before I share it again. And it gives them the opportunity to calibrate to a world that's demanding that calibration of them. I think that's why I'm so disheartened by Facebook's choice. But you might have some things to speak about being an accuracy user yourself. I think that we can maybe come up with some ideas on this in general terms. I would say seeking out information that conflicts with you and having to really work down through that. So if you find yourself getting triggered around stuff is one idea I have, and I do this often now. I'll actually seek out things that conflict with what I want to believe or what I want to see, and I have to really stop because I want to reject it almost immediately. But getting that information, even as it's really difficult for me to want to take it in, I want to get into that place where I can take it in without getting triggered or emotional around it, holding space for myself. Here, I'm using that word now. Take a drink if you're playing the game.
Take a shot.
And I think that's really one step. You might have some other ideas, Antonia, but I think that's one step for me at least.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's not so much that I think everybody needs to be massively proficient at introverted thinking. I just think that we're headed in a way where people are there on a deeply unconscious level, since the overwhelming majority of humanity has no idea what introverted thinking is as a cognitive function. We're heading toward it instinctively because we realize that we need it. And if I were to give the message to the world of, okay, guys, just back off the pedal of introverted thinking a little bit, like hand that over to maybe other people. I mean, I think that introverted thinking resources right now are becoming hugely influential. Like Snopes.com. I remember when Snopes first came out, and it was one of those places that you went to check to see if like the Ford that your grandma sent you was accurate or not, about like some picture with a, like, I don't know, with a rooster with like 12 legs or something. Now Snopes.com is like a force to be reckoned with. It vets lots of information. Very important political information is vetted through Snopes. PolitiFact is another one of them. These sources, these websites that do the research for you and let you know what they came up with. And what's so funny is you could see that people are triggered even by that, because Snopes gets accused of being a liberal rag for conservatives, and it gets accused of being a conservative rag for some liberals, because they don't really care what your political alignment is. They're just giving you the information that they discovered, which is very introverted thinking.
Sounds like WikiLeaks a little bit. I mean, we had some controversy this past fall, time of this recording, around WikiLeaks giving out information. They just so happened to have a lot stacked on one side of a political party over another, and people accused them of intentionally trying to skew things or spread misinformation, but it's been vetted that this information is in fact accurate. It just wasn't the complete picture. You didn't see all sides because that's all they had access to.
Yeah, I think Julian Assange is very clearly an introverted thinking user. And well, that's the other piece of introverted thinking, is that introverted thinking is not strategic necessarily. It can be, but it's more defaulting to transparency and truth, like well-researched, data-backed truth, than it is about necessarily trying to influence the outcome of something.
It almost feels like if people just have the truth, they'll make the right decisions.
Yes, that is the ideal of introverted thinking, which is grossly, grossly wrong. It's the challenge that people who have introverted thinking must, every person who uses TI must eventually come to that conclusion, that it has nothing to do with what the facts are for most people. It has to do with what people want to have happen. And so, it's like that's a moment of disillusionment for a lot of thinker perceivers, is like realizing that it doesn't really matter if people have the facts or not. But we are moving into a time period where people want the facts more, because there's just too much information to have to vet for themselves. So it's not so much that I think that everybody's got to get really good at it, although just like with the other functions, it's good to have a little bit in your arsenal. Right? Like it's good to have at least a little bit, and to be able to do it well, to be able to pull on it if necessary. So I do think that teaching children formal logic, or teaching children how to think, very, very important in school systems. I don't know if we're ever going to see it in the public education system as is, but it would be wonderful if it would be introduced. Being able to have a little bit is important. But I think what it is more is not assuming you're good at it when you're not. Because people want to be good at it. They want to be a person who's showing up as having just really clean data and logic, and their logic is so right. And how can you not understand, this is where their thoughts led them, and they're believing everything they think, and so that must be true if they're thinking it, and it must be rational and logical if they're thinking it. So therefore, why isn't everybody else? And if you say something that bothers me, then I need to set you right. You need to know how wrong you are. And just that alone means they're not actually using introverted thinking in a good way. So that doesn't mean to say that introverted thinking will never, again, get triggered by certain things. If it sees something that is off or empirically off with the data or whatever it is, it will come forward to say something, because that's how it rolls. But as far as anytime it's an emotionally driven righteous indignation, you're not using it anymore. And it's important to not believe you're like when you use introverted thinking in a bad way, like if you're using it in an unskilled way, like I said, it's a dull sword. It hurts when you use it. It hurts other people when you're using it. So my message would be, stop using it in a bad way. Just keep working on it. Keep building the skill. Keep looking for disciplines that help you get better at it if that's what you choose. Keep going to resources that do it extremely well, and, do what you can to make sure that you can trust those resources. Figure out if you can trust them first, and then, if you choose to trust them, then rely on that. But don't use it as a weapon, which is what I see. I see people using it as a weapon. And that's what happens when you don't know how to use a tool, is you end up accidentally weaponizing it. So as we move into a time period of introverted thinking, I just want to give a message that's probably going to hit a small group of people on the planet. But I just kind of want to get that message out there. It's better to not use it at all than to use it poorly. Rest in on your cognitive functions, figure out what your function stack is, and continue, even if we're moving into a space of introverted thinking, still use your functions the best way possible.
I think also don't dismiss or marginalize it when you see it in your life around you. So if someone in your life shows up and they're giving out really well thought out information, this isn't in your wheelhouse. You may not be that interested in it, but realize that these people are needed right now. We have so much information we're moving through. If we can help honor these people that do have this as a talent, honor how they show up, and rely on them for some of this, because you're relied on by those same people for certain things. Maybe you're an authenticity user, introverted feeling, and you're like Antonia relies upon me often to help calibrate her feelings. Weirdly enough, like she might be going through something. She's like, I don't know what I'm feeling, and we'll work through it together. And I'll work with her to calibrate maybe how I'm conflating ideas. I'll say, okay, I feel this way about something, and I got these two different thoughts, and we'll work together to parse those out. I've actually gotten really good at using introverted thinking, not to the level of any kind of TP would, but more than I would have not hanging around Antonia. And I believe you have some introverted feeling talent based on hanging around me. We've helped sharpen each other's swords in those in those ways. And we help have each other's back in that too. And so you're probably holding space and creating containers, take a drink if you're doing the drinking game, around, the talent that you show up with for the thinker perceivers in your life. And they can also help you in the same way, help you with information. Now, that means if you're a thinker perceiver, you have to be on point. You cannot be manipulative with this. If people are going to rest into you, that means you have to do it well. That means you have to show up truly looking at your own cognitive biases, and you can't let those cloud things, because if people get wind that you're manipulating using this data and they can't rest into you being purely data focused, you're going to lose trust and you're going to lose all the influence that you've built and you're building. So if you are a TP, if you're an introverted thinking user, make sure you are rooting out your own biases as much as possible so people can really trust and rest into the talent and the skill that you bring to the table. And I can see this really helping us all move forward in this.
Yeah, you just painted a really beautiful picture for me, like of an ideal world where all the TPs are rooting out their own biases and everybody else is welcoming their data. Like, that's my utopia. It's never going to happen. But maybe we can get a little further along in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can do that.
Yeah, I think this is craved like crazy. There was another candidate here in the United States, Bernie Sanders, who I believe uses introverted thinking. That was also very popular. I mean, you can probably find examples. As you're listening, you're probably thinking of examples already. You're like, oh yeah, that's where that's coming up. Oh man, this is where this is coming up. You can see this everywhere right now, needed. So this is important.
Yeah. And
we're on this trajectory of shifting over here because I think it's finally the time when introverted thinking is needed the most.
Yeah. Non-triggered truth-telling. Non-triggered truth-telling. That's really what it comes down to. And if you are a TP, if you're using introverted thinking, I'm sure that you have, like me, recognized and come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as empirical truth. Like, you have to go all the way back to math to even be able to come close to finding it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't truths that are closer to empirical truth than others. So it's not an on-off, it's a sliding scale, and it's getting as close to that clean data as humanly possible. And if you do so in a non-triggered way, if you do so with that emotional neutrality, that's what we need. So do what you can to model it. Do what you can to model it for other people. Show up in like clean data, telling it as close to truth as you possibly can get, recognizing that actual empirical truth is a beautiful lie. It's like a gorgeous concept that probably will never play out. But regardless, do it in a non-triggered space. Like right now, I cannot tell you how damaging. This is a completely subjective personal opinion, by the way. Warning: everything we say is a personal opinion, but I'm like really going into massive personal opinion. Right now, the most damaging emotion that I see around us is righteous indignation. Like, experiencing some righteous indignation for things not going well is understandable, but fueling it, feeding it, like
seeking it out,
looking for opportunities, like egging each other on with righteous indignation. I cannot think of anything that is more destructive socially right now than just this collective righteous indignation. It is so horrifying to me. It's like, it is my nightmare. The collective righteous indignation is my nightmare. So introverted thinking is needed because it tells the truth that other people want told without bringing that toxic element of that righteous indignation.
And to go back to what we started this out, talking about how everything's shifting toward from a judger perspective to a perceiver perspective, or a perceiver energy in the world, what's happening is a lot of the FPs, feeler perceivers, that introverted feeling, that's where a lot of this righteous indignation is coming out. And there is a place for that, to get upset about things that aren't honoring the individual, aren't honoring people. And yet, I think it needs to be tempered with both perceiving energies, not just the introverted feeling. It needs to be tempered with clean data and the introverted thinking part as well. And I think that's where we're going to find this balance going forward, is we've had this introverted feeling, righteous indignation, or standing up for our individual rights before, but we've never needed the tempering of introverted thinking like we do now. Because just with one and not the other, you're going to lose out both. Like, if we're shifting this energy toward a perceiving energy, we need both of those represented. Just like in the past, if we were just all about extroverted thinking, about structure and about getting, infrastructure built in the outside world, and we didn't take extroverted feeling into account, the human element and the human structures, we'd lose something. You needed both at that time period. So as we move this energy, I think we need both of these as well. So out of this, I say that we are shifting to perceiver. I think the natural progression, because we've been here before, is introverted feeling as the perceiver process of choice, and we've got to temper it with introverted thinking, or we're going to lose our way quickly.
Introverted thinking wants to know, it wants accuracy, which is why we nicknamed it accuracy. Like, it wants to have an accurate concept of where we're at in the stream of time. And I think introverted feeling, we mentioned that society went, at least in this country, that direction in the 60s and 70s, based on, I think some of that outrage was necessary at that time period. I think introverted feeling was exactly what the doctor ordered during that time period, because there were things to be outraged about. And it was moving away from that extroverted thinking / extroverted feeling time period of wanting everybody to conform. So I think it was the right tool for the job at the time. But what happens, I think, with introverted feeling is that the idealism that is its strength also can become its weakness if it's trying to foist that idealism off on others. And so, like, right now, what I see, especially with things like, social justice warriors and other very, we get to a point where we get really zoomed in on how we're supposed to be honoring each other, which is not necessarily a bad thing to want to honor people in very nuanced ways. I think that's a really good thing. But when you attach it to this idealism of how we all should be behaving right now, one of the tools that ends up getting implemented is extreme social shame if a person isn't there yet. It's hard to hold space for all the individuals if there's a sense that holding space for those people continues some sort of oppression. And I think what introverted thinking does in that space is it recognizes that they're just, like, not everybody's at the same space. It takes into account the entire system and recognizes that there's the node in the system that there's some people just don't understand what the concept of, say, appropriation is. They just don't get it. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad or wrong. That's just where they're at. And so to socially shame that person, or to say that that person's bad or wrong, in order to try to basically muscle them into the quote unquote right behavior or the right mindset, that's something that introverted thinking done extremely well will not do. It won't do that because that's not a sustainable thought process. Just like extroverted thinking is trying to figure out sustainable systems in the outside world, introverted thinking is attempting to find sustainable ways of seeking truth. And muscling somebody and socially censuring them is not an introverted thinking tool. That's more like extroverted feeling done wrong. So what's great about introverted thinking showing up right now is that some of these styles of trying to pretend we're further along than we are now getting sort of reconciled. And we're getting a lot more accurate of a picture of where we're at in the stream of time, which means that we're going to be better at paving, a road in front of us. We just had a podcast on this about, staying positive in a time period where the world feels like it's, getting you down. And what's nice about introverted thinking is that it gives us some hope that just having that precision accuracy of where we're at is a good piece of information. That's a relevant piece of data that we need. So as we continue on, seeing how this all unfolds, I think we've been in a perceiver time period since the 60s, 70s, like you mentioned, Joel. I think we went to a perceiver time period, around that time. And it's just morphed from introverted feeling and like that human potential movement concept, etc. And now it's moved into an introverted thinking time period. And once this time period has gone through and completed what it needs to do, my suspicion is we're going to go back into a judger time period. We'll enter a space of extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling again, whichever one is the right tool for the job at the time. My suspicion is probably extroverted feeling. That's my guess, because we're entering kind of like that Graves 6C time period or spiral dynamics green. My guess is it's probably going to look very extroverted feeling. But until we get to that time period collectively, right now we are in introverted thinking, and let's just try to do it the best we can. Let's see if we can get through this space, like really trying to dial back that indignation and trying to collectively get real precise.
Yeah, if you are a new listener, we got pretty technical in this episode. One of the things you can do is go over to our website and just search in the search bar car model. And that's going to give you a little more detail of what we're talking about. It's going to give us what's called cognitive functions, is what we've been referencing, this introverted feeling cognitive function. It's basically how some people's brains are wired to make decisions. And it's going to give you a lot of this framework for how we're talking about this if you're a new listener. Don't get lost. We usually don't go this deep into technical aspects. We want to have you join us in the next episode and just understand that we will tether this to things as we talk. And that's one way you can tether what we're talking about today to a model and a framework to understand what we mean. And again, if you go over to personalityhacker.com, you can leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast show. We can help answer things more for you if you have some confusion or some questions about what we're talking about. And we've got tons of free articles and videos and resources there that you can engage with to learn more about what we're talking about. And if you go back podcasts, I mean, we've got tons of podcasts recorded, almost 3 years worth now at this point, to unpack some of these concepts and these ideas. So go search that out on your own. We also want to invite you to join our community of like minds that's growing every day. It's over at facebook.com/personality hacker, or you can also join in on twitter.com/personality hack, HACK.
If you like this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, if you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that really helps us out.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Thanks for being with us this week at the Personality Hacker Podcast. We'll talk with you on the next episode.